We are live.
We're live. Brian, how are you?
I'm ready to testify. I'm ready to be electrified. I'm so ready for this. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I enjoyed going back to the show, and I know you guys have thoughts. You and Matt, who's here with us as well. Hi, Matt.
Hey there, howdy. How's it going?
Oh man, you know how it is. Things are great. Getting
Just
ready for
trying,
some getting ready for some stuff. What are you doing, Matt?
just trying to find some office supplies.
Oh man, we're gonna talk about Mr. Staples. Um, so we're here and we're gonna talk about this Bruce Springsteen show from 10/23/99. If you're listening to the show and you enjoy it, keep sending us messages, feedback, things like that. It's been fun, but Brian, before we get into it, is this before your first show?
This is 3 weeks after my first show. My first Bruce show was 9/30/99 from the United Center, which was not owned by Mr. United as much as Bruce wanted it to be. Um, 3 weeks prior to this, I sat on the floor. I was thinking about that show during this concert, as we'll get into, because there's like a ton of energy out the gates, and then Bruce kind of quiets it down. And I just remember there was a guy 5 seats away from us during the quiet section that just kept yelling, "Play one of the bangers!" And my dad finally looked over at him and said, "I'm trying to enjoy myself." And I realized concerts were not all roses and hugs and what you see in the movies. I then went and saw the Rolling Stones documentary about Altamont and realized it could be a completely different thing, but that's a different subject for a different day. But I'm very
Man,
excited for this.
that's amazing. So your dad didn't get in a fight though.
He didn't, but it came very close. The guy did not want to hear Mansion on the Hill at his first Bruce show back since 1988. And you know what? I can blame him for that because that's a great song and it was beautiful for Bruce to play it midway through the show.
All right, we got that intro. Um, Hello, Craig. Afternoon to you too. Thank you guys for tuning in. We want to tell you a couple things before we get into it. Okay, so first, Matt and I and Megan from HF Pod, we're going to be in AC this weekend, and there's a few things happening. First is that on Saturday afternoon from 2 to 4, if you happen to be going to Atlantic City for Fish, come hang out with us on Saturday afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m. We're going to be Saturday, we're going to be interviewing John Barber of the Disco Biscuits. He's going to play acoustic music. We're going to do a recap of the Fish show from the night before. Then on Sunday, we're going to do an auction benefiting the Water Wheel Foundation, and we have a pretty cool bundle of things to give away. I don't know, Brian or Matt, if you guys have seen any of the previews of the stuff we have, but we have a bunch of pretty cool Fish merch and other things to give away. We have a test pressing of a live one that we're going to auction off. We have a bunch of cool stuff. So that's going to be happening on Sunday from 2 to 4. All of these will be at the Anchor Rock Club. And you can go to osirispod.com/Osiris Live to see the details. The other thing we're doing for these AC shows, we're giving away 3-day passes. And everyone who's gotten one of these thinks it's pretty cool. I think it's pretty cool too. We have 4 winners from the contest that we ran last week. And I'm going to tell you who those people are right now. And if you're one of those people, you'll be excited. And if you're not, then just keep playing along. So Tim McCormick, who's at Tim McCormick 9 on Twitter. Avi, whose name we don't know, but his Instagram handle is Jew Chains with a Z. Congrats, Avi, Tim, Ian Stone, and Shane Carr. So congrats to all you. You'll be getting 3-day passes to the AC shows this coming weekend. And maybe Fish will cover Atlantic City by Bruce, just like their heroes, Goose. What do you guys think?
I think that Paige could sing Atlantic City really nicely. Be a good late set one sample there. But hey, amazing work by all of you out there entering into the contest, winning tickets to Fish Atlantic City. I would be freaking out right now. That's awesome.
Matt, you don't appear to be thinking that Fish is going to cover that song.
Yeah, probably about the most unfish thing that they could do. Um, I think that they're probably avoiding Bruce songs after they tried to play Thunder Road when the big man died. And
Mm.
as much as I was excited about that, it didn't exactly turn out well. So they might be heading in a different direction these days.
2 years after they had Bruce on stage, and I don't think that recording exists unless you're one of those lucky few that have the soundboards of it. I don't think it's up on Live Fish anymore. When they played, what do they do? Mustang Sally, Glory Days, and Bobby Jean with Bruce.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and those were good selections, just like the bar band kind of songs. They probably should just played one of those, but no, I mean I'm just joking around. I know they have ultimate reverence for Bruce, and maybe who knows, maybe we'll hear like "Darkness on the Edge of Town" or something like that.
It's crazy when 1984 era Bruce Springsteen joined Fish on stage in 1999 to play. Somehow he time traveled and played "Born to Run with Them." That's a great, great cover. They should revive that again.
Well, we are not here to completely talk about Fish. We're talking about Bruce Springsteen today, and we're talking about this show from October 23rd, 1999, at the Staples Center. This venue, Bruce talks about it. Now, I don't know. I don't know if Bruce would be excited or not that it's now called the Crypto.com Arena. Maybe that's an improvement over the Staples Center. But Brian, how long has this venue been around?
So this venue opened in the fall of 1999. Springsteen actually opened it with his. He did 4 shows at the Staples Center in October '99, the 17th, I believe the 18th, and then he came back for to close that out with the 22nd and 23rd. It opened to be the home of the Los Angeles Lakers, the Los Angeles Clippers, and the Los Angeles Kings. It's hosted a number of NBA finals because of the Lakers, not because of the Clippers, as well as the Kings being in the Stanley Cup finals. As you said, is now named Crypto.com Arena. A couple other notable artists that have played there. Dave Matthews played there in the summer 2008, including the night that their saxophonist Leroy Moore passed away. Good callback to our previous season here on the live show. And Taylor Swift has played 16 sold out shows there. This was kind of this along with the American Airlines Center and the American Airlines Arena in Dallas and Miami, respectively, were kind of the new wave of basketball, hockey arenas that opened in the late 1990s, early 2000s that they still feel fairly modern today. They kind of revamped the way that arenas were set up, revamped where skyboxes are located and suites are located, and really just like gave a more luxurious and high end experience to the basketball, hockey, as well as concert going experience.
Have you guys been to the Staples Center?
I have not. I've always wanted to go. I really want to go to a Lakers game at some point.
Yeah, I have not. I've never really spent any time in LA, so I have not been there. But I've been to many of those newer wave arenas, or at least new at the time in the '90s arenas, and have many thoughts on those as we get into our themes today.
um, so 1999, we're in a strange period for Bruce, in my opinion, mostly because I don't. This is like I'm much more familiar with the 70s, than the late 90s. I'm not sure I've ever listened to a 1999 Bruce show until now, so it's a new experience for me. But what was going on here in terms of the tour? Like where do we find ourselves here in late '99?
Yeah, I mean, this is halfway through their second leg of the reunion tour. Matt, I feel like you might know this better than I do. How long had there been rumors for the band to reunite in 1999, like leading up to this point in time?
I don't really know because at that point I wasn't really active in like Bruce Springsteen online chatter and stuff like that. It kind of caught a lot of people off guard. I remember there's probably rumors for all of the '90s, right? Because
Mhm.
that's what people wanted to see happen. But I remember the tour started with something like maybe 20 shows at Brendan Byrne or whatever you wanted to call the arena at that point. And then moved to Philly right after that, I believe, which is where I saw my first Bruce show. And that was, I think, a 15 night run. And they weren't like, consecutive. There were some breaks. So in my memory, it was basically like all of September, or at least most of September. Bruce was at the then pretty new Wells Fargo Center in Philly. Cool thing, and this will kind of add to what I want to talk about the venues. They did something really neat, which was in the middle of that long run, which was at the new arena. They played one show across the parking lot at the Spectrum, kind of for old time's sake. That was the show that I went to. That was my first Bruce show. I was also on the floor. I think it was like 15 rows from the stage or something like that. It was insane. But I think it's interesting to hear Bruce's commentary about the bigger new venues, given that he had this nod to old places in his previous tour stop. The other thing to keep in mind is that like Bruce was kind of passé at this point. He had struggled throughout the 90s. His image was kind of slipping. These shows were amazing sellout successes, but like it wasn't like this inspired a new generation of people to go see Bruce, or like people were into it. And like I missed it in the past. When I went to the show, the next morning I went to school, and I was surprised that like there was like two other kids that were wearing a t-shirt from the night before. And I doubt anybody else in our high school was going to see Bruce that month. It was just like, oh my God, like you guys too, your parents probably turned you on to this stuff. And like, we finally get to see the E Street Band. But we were definitely in the minority at that point. So I think there's a lot of Bruce kind of like 99 to 2002 kind of clawing his way back into the pop culture discussion.
Yeah, I remember the shirt I bought at the concert was just the River album cover with the song titles on the back, and you could buy every single album through Tunnel of Love. Like that was the t-shirt that they were selling along with a tour shirt. And I bought that. I wore it to school the next day. I had the exact same experience. There was like one other kid in the lunchroom, and we were just like isolated to one corner of the high school cafeteria talking about Bruce Springsteen when everyone else just could not care less. I think it's also, and we're going to get into it here, like from a set listing standpoint, from the way that these shows are structured, this is kind of the closest thing you're going to get to a greatest hits Bruce run. Aside from in the 2010s, when you start to see him celebrate full albums, it's really him like showcasing aspects of his past that people had been wanting throughout the 80s and had been craving throughout the 90s when there were no E Street Band shows. I think the only other thing I would say is 3 years prior, there's kind of like the Bruce, the early hint of a Bruce revival moment when he comes on stage with the Wallflowers to sing One Headlight. And I think it's the MTV VMAs. And he sings the second verse of it, and it's such a 90s moment because it's such a 90s song. He's got a goatee, but he like lays into it. And if you go back and watch the video, it's like the first time you can hear Bruce be like, okay, maybe there is a pathway back for me somehow. I don't know exactly when it's going to come, but maybe there's a pathway back for me to actually dominate the zeitgeist again.
And well, you guys were a lot cooler than me. I guess I was just going to fish shows in high school, so I don't know. I guess that's cool also. But now I'm way behind. And speaking of being way behind, this is the first time I've ever heard the song "Take 'Em as They Come." I was like, "What the hell is this song?" And I know that was part of one of your kind of takeaways, Brian. But it's like an outtake sort of song, right?
Yeah, so it was right around this point in time. Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. This was right around the time that Tracks was released, which released a bunch of unreleased tracks that came out that were recorded throughout the 70s and 80s, right?
Yeah, and that's something that I was thinking a lot about. I guess it probably occurred to me at the time, but I haven't really thought about it much, which is that like Tracks came out right before this tour. So I think that was part of it, was like, this is the new album that we're touring behind kind of thing. You know what I mean? So like the new where he would slot in new songs from a new album in, you know, positions in the set list, he was instead playing like songs that were, you know, 20 years old that had never been performed on stage. So um like you said, a lot of greatest hits stuff, but also like on the flip side, stuff for the like the seriously hardcore fans that wanted to hear, you know, "Take 'Em as They Come," which is a outtake from The River, and a lot of those other songs that came up at this point. So I think that's probably where, like, you know, you were talking before about like the guy not being able to tolerate, you know, Quiet Bruce. Like there was a degree of that going on, which is like the people who know Born to Run and came out, and then the people who were like hardcore fans since the 70s, but didn't just want to see the same old show, and now they were seeing songs for the first time. And Bruce managed to please both audiences.
Yeah, he talks about it because like this show has Take 'Em as They Come, Incident on 57th Street, For You, Blinded by the Light, in one of its very, very rare performances post 70s, and The Promise, which he plays on solo piano. And he talks beforehand that, you know, this is, I forget exactly the term he uses, but like this is for like the deep cut fans. Like this is for, I think, the connoisseurs is what he says, you know. And you hear like applause from the audience that's clearly not the audience. It's clearly the people who have been like collecting whatever bootlegs they can get their hands on, and like, you know, took a lien on their house to buy you know, tickets to like 5 or 6 shows straight back to back, because these were at, was this the biggest tour of like where was this at in terms of like what else is going on in 99? Like the Stones aren't on tour at this point in time. I didn't look this up, but like this is the big tour of the year.
Yeah, this was, I mean, without research here, I would say it was definitely one of the highest grossing. Although this was probably like the highest grossing bands that year, if I had to guess, would be like NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, stuff like that. They were hitting every single city and selling out. But in,
Santana.
Santana. No, actually, in 1999, I saw Santana open for Dave Matthews. I mean, that
Oh
was
wow.
like,
Wow.
yeah, they were. It was pre Super Unknown, and actually like a killer show because that stuff hadn't come out yet, and so it was just classics. But anyway, the Stones were on tour. They toured the No Security tour in
Oh
'99,
yeah.
and but that was arenas, and I think it was a somewhat limited number of shows. I saw that tour too. But yeah, I mean, in terms and regionally things vary, but like I think in the Northeast, you know, where I was, like this was the big music news of the year. You know, this and Woodstock '99, basically.
Yeah. So, well, Brian, you kind of talked about a little bit about the greatest hits or the songs here. I have a couple specific takeaways about some of the songs from this show. Just listening back and had a few thoughts. But Matt, can you talk about one of the themes, which I think applies to kind of the whole show? Just your first one.
Yeah, you know, I mean, we're talking about Bruce kind of clawing his way back into the popular spotlight. And for an artist like Bruce, who is sort of continuously moving forward and taking chances so much, you have to ask yourself at the end of the 90s, is this him sort of retreating and saying, like, I'm only as good as the stuff I've done before, so let's just go out and play some greatest hits shows? Because you know, there's these outtakes that they play a lot, the stuff from The Promise, which is not really sort of like the focus of the tour. The focus is really just the fact that these guys are back and playing together. But you know, I have to ask that question, like, can you go as an artist, like, can you go backwards a little bit back to where you were, and then move forward and not sacrifice anything? Can you eventually create a new era of your career, or do you have to make this decision to just become, you know, a legacy act that just goes out, plays the hits, and then sleeps on a bed of money?
I think that's the most interesting like takeaway from this era for him. And you know, you think basically this is around the 30-year mark of when the E Street Band, you know, in time, they obviously weren't playing in the 90s, but like this is 30 years since the E Street Band begins. And that, you and I were talking about this a little bit in our last episode, Matt, like Bruce is in such an unknown terrain in the late 1990s as the band is getting back together, because reunion tours at this point were really just looked at as kind of like a cash grab, and were really just looked at as kind of like play the hits, satisfy, both your diehards, but also like this wide swath of fans who have heard Born to Run, Born in the USA, go back and make a bunch of solo records. And instead, it seems like the challenge was accepted by Springsteen to reinvent this band. And, one of the things I thought about this was, you know, the unknown opportunities of a reunion, and the fact that he's going to all of these deep cuts, and he's going to songs like For You as a full band, The Promise, Blinded by the Light, Take 'Em as They Come, all these track songs that had never been played live, or had been played live like sparingly in the 1980s, and then figuring out where is the next step forward for it. And I feel like in a lot of cases, Springsteen opened the doors to a lot of artists, that you could reunite this thing that worked in the past, but find some new avenue for that to take you to another area of creativity, which over the last 20 years, he's released consistent records. He's experimented in really unique ways. He really hasn't just rested on, this is what I did during my peak period, and we're going to bring this forward. Like, he's continued to make new music and push that in a really inspiring way.
Yeah, this is man, some of the stuff, I mean, like, I guess some of the songs that are played here are songs from albums that I'm just not familiar with. Like Youngstown, for example, is a song that I've heard before, but like not super familiar with. I had this thought, just like a Bruce as like, or like Factory, which is earlier. That sounds like, I love Darkness on the Edge of Town, but this like idea of Bruce writing for the working people is just like, it just is, sometimes it's like so great and hits so perfectly, and then sometimes like I'm just like, this is like a little much. Like Youngstown is a little over the top, it's like there's so many of his songs that are like, we went to work today, came home, I'm tired, got to go back tomorrow. Like Youngstown is sort of like that. And there's the blast furnace here along the shore, they made the cannonballs that helped the Union win the war here in Youngstown. It's just like, what do you guys think about that part of his, about mostly writing, not even necessarily singing or playing, but just like the writing, the Bruce as John Steinbeck angle of his writing?
It's interesting because, like, Ghost of Tom Joad, it's like the closest corollary to that record in his career is Nebraska, and then Devils and Dust, which came out in 2005. It's very introspective, quiet Springsteen. It's, from a lyrical standpoint, like the lyrics are very forward, like they're out there right in right in your face. Whereas on some of his E Street Band records, like the music really carries it. I think it's, as he would evolve in the 2000s, his more comfortable writing place now is something that Matt and I were talking about on Friday or on Thursday, which is this kind of healing aspect, where he was still in 1995 exploring what the working man in America was going through. I think that in some cases it almost was outdated at the time, because nobody was really having conversations about factory towns in 1990s America. It really didn't come up until like 15 years later. So it's in this weird period where, like, 1999 America is not thinking about looming financial crises based around offshore, outsourced jobs. It sounds a little bit like he's just updating his conversations from the 1970s and 1980s, which I think might play a part in, your interpretation of it there. I like that he still explored it. I don't think it's the best song on Ghost of Tom Joad. But I think that it kind of showcases where he was lost in the mid 1990s more than anything. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, he lost a lot of fans in the 90s through things like the, Human Touch Lucky Town albums, which were kind of very out of character for him. Ghost of Tom Joad, I remember not actually being very interested in it at the time. It since has become probably, my favorite of his acoustic albums. And the title track is absolutely amazing.
The
But this was
harp on that,
also,
man. My God.
yeah. Um, he got a boost. Incidentally enough, I'm going to see Rage Against the Machine tomorrow night, yeah. And they probably gave him a huge boost by covering Ghost of Tom Joad, and Tom Morello's admiration for Bruce gave him a lot of like hipster cachet back then. But this tour then is the first time that he's playing those songs electrified, similar to how like in the Born in the USA tour 84 85 he's playing the Nebraska songs for the first time in electrified versions. Atlantic City becomes like a powerhouse song rather than just this sort of sparse sad thing that it is on Nebraska. So I think that just adds to this fuel to this fire of like Bruce trying to get back to what he does the best, and reset a little bit and carve a new path forward, that rather than trying all of these different things he was in the 90s, which really weren't really working from a commercial standpoint.
Yeah, and just one thing to add to that, like the cachet that came from Raging Against the Machine covering him was both from you're introducing his music to a younger audience, you're making him look cooler, but it was also like one of the appeals of Rage Against the Machine in the 1990s was like you're politicizing rock music in a way that it was politicized in the 60s and 70s. And as a young person hearing these songs that are like, about revolutions in Latin America that you literally are not being taught in school. You have no idea that this is happening, just thousands of miles south of you, same time zone, same area of the planet that you're in, but you're not aware of it. That was so much of what Bruce's appeal was in the 70s. And I think there, I'm just kind of throwing this theory out as it's coming into my head, but like as we project forward 2 or 3 years in America, 9/11's coming, the war in Iraq's coming, the financial crisis is coming. Like we're seeing aspects of the world open up for someone like Bruce Springsteen to write about what he writes about best. As someone who has grown to love Human Touch and Lucky Town, and I can't wait till we address those albums. I agree with you. That is not Bruce's best space at all. And the mid 1990s are not really the time for like what Bruce was singing about in the 70s and 80s, but you're starting to see like the path be laid for him to jump on that cultural cachet that he's got again, plus also address areas that are in pain throughout America.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like if you think about the fact that he's singing these songs in 1999 and Rage is singing the songs that they're writing around that time a little bit earlier, but it just makes some of these songs seem like really outdated and old fashioned,
Yeah.
you know? I mean, it's the same idea, like generally, but just it's just totally different message, you know? I mean, and some of those Rage songs are still like really badass now, you know? Like I'm not sure Youngstown is like that badass, but I think it's great that he's like addressing this stuff, but it's just interesting to compare those two.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but they did in this show. There is a mix of like you were saying, Brian, kind of like going back and forth between newer stuff and older stuff. I like the segment. I mean, I just like the older stuff, but I did like the first. I thought like the first quarter of the show had a lot of like a good mix of those things. Having Adam Raised a Cain and Darkness and Promised Land mixed in with some of a couple of the songs earlier that are later on. I don't know. I thought it flowed pretty well. And then there's we got to talk about the storytelling here. I mean, there's the 10th Avenue Freeze Out is just it's something else. Is that out of the ordinary? Because I feel like that was what a 5 minute monologue, which I think generally that happens once a show. But does that moment stand out to you guys in terms of the banter and the revivalist Bruce?
It kind of falls in line with like a lot of what we've heard throughout the 70s, to me, but it also like um it's a bit over the top, and it's rightly so a bit over the top. I mean, I really wonder what he felt like at this point in time, because we're basically 8 months into his reunion with this band, 8, 9 months into the reunion with this band in terms of the live shows that they've been playing. They go to Europe, they come back to America, they release tracks, and they're doing these arena tours throughout parts of America. And like, I really wonder if at this point, every single night, like the gratitude that he's showcasing towards his bandmates, like what that feels like on stage, because you get the impression listening to 10th Avenue Freeze Out that this is the first time that they've played together in 15 years. That's just like what he projects out to the audience. It's part that myth that he tells about the legend of the E Street Band and how over the top he is with that. It's also, I think it's celebratory on his behalf that like, I never thought I'd have the chance to do this again, but I really wonder what that was like on an emotional level each night. What are your thoughts on it, Matt?
I think it was also a bit of an apology because, he had basically broken this band up and none of them were superstars on their own. Steven had already left the band earlier, tried a solo career in the 80s, didn't really make much of it. Clarence was out hanging out in Marin County with Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir and playing with them sometimes. And, that was kind of it. I mean, so I think, and from what I understand, there was a lot of bad blood, around him breaking up the band at the end of '88. So, I think that's a lot of it, like wanting to put this spotlight on the band and make sure that people knew about every single individual member. And, he used to do this in Rosalita. And as we've talked about a couple of times at this point, he really wasn't playing Rosalita live and, had to have the song, which 10th Avenue Freeze Out tells the story of the band getting together. So we took that as the opportunity, but you're right. It gets a bit long. It goes kind of over the top. I used to watch, there's a great DVD from this tour, the Live in New York City DVD, which came from a live broadcast that was on HBO at Madison Square Garden. And it's such an amazing show, but I used to like skip past this song every single time because it's like it's 20 minutes long of him just like introduce, and I'm sure I mean, I remember it was fun in the room, like have that back and forth and stuff like that, but at a certain point it's like, all right, Bruce, you gotta rein it in just a little bit.
It is like that line even on the album Born to Run. The change came uptown and the big man joined the band. Like, I get chills every time I hear it, just because like it tells specifically where he was at. Like, you get this sense of a guy who is running out of money, running out of time, running out of people believing in him, like running out of excuses of why he hasn't made it yet. And, this huge saxophone player, a legend beyond, like not a person who can be like contained in human skin, comes to him and like gives this like soulful aspect to his band in a way that like nobody else could have. And the way that he then like cuts off the song right before it gets that line, stretches out this monologue. One time through, it's really great to listen to, but I agree with you. Like the next time through, you kind of know the beats of it, you know where it's going. It is really wild though to think about, like, 1999, he addresses that Max has been hired as the drummer for Conan. The Sopranos launched in January of 1999, and Lil Steven is Silvio in that. Like, these two cores of the band are not making their money and their career off of music. Like, to your point, none of these artists, Nils Lofgren was able to play with other bands, was it, part of Crazy Horse prior to this. But like none of these artists are making a name. It's not like a lot of bands breaking up where you see multiple artists either go and join other bands or go off onto a successful solo career. Like, these guys are session musicians and bar musicians without Bruce Springsteen. And it's kind of him realizing, I need this band because my career was in total flux over the last 10 years and I was just like lost in the wilderness, but they also need me, and like this partnership back and forth. It's that realization of kind of what I had said in the doc, like it's these unknown opportunities of reunion. You can think about it in the same manner that like I think we all celebrate when Fish got back together in 2009. There's a world where the Hampton reunion happens, everyone celebrates, everyone's super happy, but like they didn't feel it. They didn't feel the creative juice to keep going. The fact that they then put the work in after that is the same with what the E Street band does here. They put the work in post this tour to figure out how do we make it as a band going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I was listening to this, like I mentioned earlier, I don't listen to a lot of Bruce shows outside of the late 70s, early 80s, but this is sort of seems to me like, especially during like Backstreet's and, um, was Backstreet's solo piano or was it just The Promise?
Just the promise.
Just the
Just The
promise.
Promise, which I want to ask you guys about that. Like Backstreet's, the band comes back in, and this is kind of like, is this like the peak of their powers as a rock and roll band? Because I think like the late 70s are so great for all the reasons that we've talked about, but this feels like a really kind of like powerful band. And I don't know, Matt, if this is in conflict with your theme about kind of playing in a new arena like this, but I thought it sounded like a rock band that really like had it together at this point. I mean, maybe it was just the excitement and enthusiasm being back together, but this feels like it's like peak power for the E Street band. I don't know if you guys disagree. If you do, you should tell me, please.
Yeah, I mean, I would still, you probably look to like 78 to 84 in terms of like the peak powers of the band, but this is a very, very, very good band. They're playing with similar energy and stamina as they had been, the last time they were together. They have the common language and the common kind of intuition to be able to just know how to play together as a band. And, as Brian noted, they've been on the road for months at this point on the reunion tour. So I think they got really strong over that period. And as far as age, I mean, it's kind of crazy. They were like, Bruce was like, just had turned 50 when this show happened.
Yeah.
The rest of the band's, similar ages. So a lot more energy, ability to play songs at, faster tempos and stuff like that. And also the first time that they had 3 guitars in the band, because Nils and Miami Steve had not been in the band at the same time before then, plus Bruce, plus Patty plays acoustic sometimes. So it was sort of like the start of what we talked about with like the 2012 show last week of like building this into kind of like the E Street Orchestra by adding members to fill in some of the gaps. So I think that's probably also what you're hearing is just, extra energy coming from the guitars. But it is great to look back and see how awesome they were at this point. It just occurred to me, like while I was talking, like this was actually only 11 years after they had played. Like it wasn't the biggest, reunion ever. And they, I mean, they had like, I'm sure Bruce saw them and there were different sit-ins and stuff like that over the years following that. But, that's like, there's bands that just like don't tour for 11 years, and they don't break up or anything like that. So it was somewhat short. And in the context of the 90s, you had like, for example, the Eagles were like the big reunion a couple years before this, and they hadn't played together and like felt like forever, but it was actually only like 14 years. Fleetwood Mac got back together, the core lineup, but they hadn't played together in like 6 or 7 years. So like there's a lot being made at that point about like relaunching these legacy artists careers. I think a little bit of magic to make it seem like it was such a big deal.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of that is context. Like it's been 20 plus years since these shows happened. You go back to the late 1990s, like the world of rock music really only had existed for 40 years at that point in time. So like an 11-year, 14-year gap felt like, it was like the Police were never going to get together at this point in time. And then they got back together, 7 years later. This is like right around the time when classic rock bands are discovering like you don't break up, you kind of go on hiatus, you go off and you do your thing, and then 4 years later you do a big arena tour. I think the big thing that's different here with Bruce is like you can hear the bigness that you're talking about, RJ, which almost feels like a band realizing like, holy shit, this was a loss. Like we did not have this for so long, and now we have it again, and there's that energy poured into it. But then there's also this kind of idea of what's next. Like, are we going to actually keep trying to do this, or are we just going to do a reunion tour? And as you'll see within the next 3 years, they're going to come out with new music, and they're going to really try to push new ideas within this frame of what the E Street Band is.
Yeah, there's something else that kind of dovetails with this. We were talking before about the different venues and Bruce making fun of the Staples Center and all the luxury boxes, and I think that's a problem. That's a problem I have with newer arenas. It's, I think, a problem that a lot of other bands, artists have. They don't like playing those rooms. Once you add all the luxury boxes, it just makes the room so much bigger, and the acoustics aren't as good, and the audience is further away. But this kind of era of these newer arenas opening with all of these sort of niceties, gelling with his fan base, probably hitting the point where they have, investment accounts and 401ks and, wanting to maybe sit in a box and sip champagne while they're watching the boss instead of being on the floor spilling a cup of Budweiser all over everybody. It's kind of like, like you were just describing, like the launch of like classic rock as an industry, and appealing to a certain demographic that might like the comfort, but you're definitely losing something in terms of just going to a sweaty rock concert in a dingy building and loving it.
Yeah, I mean, like I experienced. You talked about seeing the Springsteen show at the Spectrum. We used to have Chicago Stadium. That's where I saw my first Bulls games. That's where I saw the Hawks. Like that stadium kind of terrified me. No matter where you walked, no matter what time you walked into the stadium, your feet stuck to the pavement. There was no carpeting anywhere. It was just like it was a cement room that was like compacted on each other. It was super loud. It felt like it was going to fall apart at any minute. And then going to see basketball and hockey games at the United Center, suddenly it was lush. There were suite levels. There were really nice food options. It's become slightly outdated in the 25 years since it was open, but this was that era of like Springsteen was meant to be played at a bar. And then if he was going to play in a stadium, if he was going to play in an arena, he was meant to be played in one that was kind of dingy and kind of run down. And here he is, like these are the only places left for him to play in.
And worth noting, he has not played the Staples Center again. This was it. So
Yeah.
I think he was a little bit more than joking when he poked fun at it.
Too bad for Taylor Swift. It's yeah, I mean, the Youngstown lyrics, I don't know how those really land in the Staples Center from a box,
In Live City. Yeah.
the coal mines of Appalachia.
Can I ask a
Go
quick
ahead, Brent.
question?
Yeah.
Just off the fly. We don't have this in the doc, so if you guys don't have an answer off the fly, it's okay. But you should think of one. Who could be the band today that would be on the level of what the E Street Band was doing in 1999? I know the thought in my head, but I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts.
It's a really good question.
You mean like coming back, trying to come back?
Yeah, mine is like, and it kind of goes in line with what Matt was saying earlier that like 11 years isn't that long, but it felt like an eternity in 1999. For me, the answer would be Radiohead right now, which they toured 5 years ago, which isn't a long time, but like we're kind of getting to a point where we're like, is Radiohead actually a band still? Are they going to continue releasing records? Um, I was thinking about it towards the end of this volume where Bruce talks about like, I believe in the power of rock and roll. This is my job. This is my duty. This is my calling. And that sense of like, you can imagine all of the audience who was our age and maybe 4 or 5 years older, like in that late 30s to late 40s range, where Bruce is something that they needed and they needed to celebrate and they needed that outpouring. And a band like Radiohead today, do they exist? Do they not exist? Like Tom is making records with like two members of Radiohead, or one other member of Radiohead, and then no one else. It feels like that would be a moment of a band that we all grew up with, and we're going back to see again. That we didn't think we would see again, at least at this point in time. But I don't know if there's another thought you guys have.
The one that really comes to mind is probably Daft Punk. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, I think A lot of bands have learned, like you were saying before, like don't break up, just take time off and figure it out. And you might want to come back, or break up, announce that it's the last thing that you're ever possibly going to do, and then come back like 2 years later on a reunion tour.
The LCD sound system model, yeah.
Yeah, because I was gonna say LCD Sound System. If they had not gotten back together, I would definitely say they were that band.
Yeah.
But they got back together real quick, and I think lost a lot of sort of the credo that they had
By breaking up,
after. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I guess the Black Crowes sort of did that, and are in the middle of doing it, right? It's been a long time, but I don't know if it's at that level.
Maybe Oasis getting back together and playing What's Story Morning Glory in full, plus debuting some new songs about whatever controversy is going to happen 2 years from now with the band. I don't know. Yeah, like there are these bands from the 90s that are now at a point of like we're 25 years from those records coming out. We're like at the point where that sort of nostalgia and that sort of reunion is happening.
Yeah, but nothing on this level, of Bruce anyway. Well, all right. Let's go to our most boss moment. I'm going to start because I want to comment on yours, Brian. But I think that the solo piano, The Promise, it starts a little quiet, and he's like messing with the levels, and like seems like a little tentative, and then goes into it. And I think it's a great performance, and I just think it's really cool. So I really like that moment, and I think it's a really nice moment, especially keeping in mind that it's in like this giant new arena. It feels like a pretty intimate moment, and then the band comes back, for Backstreets. I think that's a great segment for Bruce.
I think there's a lot of intimacy in these shows that is really cool. There's a lot of I'm going to play these songs that I either played rarely or I never played at all. And you guys are going to get a peek into it because, who knows what they were thinking as they were promoting this tour, as they were announcing this tour in terms of like what ticket sales are going to be. There's always the risk that you're going after an arena or run of arenas that are not going to pack the rooms. Like these were as in-demand tickets as you could possibly get in 1999. So there's almost like a thanks from his behalf, not only to the band for sticking with me, but also to the audience for you all have been here through kind of ups and downs that I've been through over the last 10 years. I think mine is, I have two. First is the moment after the Promised Land when he does his monologue, "Good evening, Mr. Staples," and he talks through corporate rebranding. He talks about how LA is now going to be corporatized and Miami is just going to be known as the swoosh symbol. They're going to be like Prince. And he just kind of goes on. It feels in line with, we talked about this last season on our Dave Matthews series, the like 90s politicization. And like, we know now 20 plus years on, the reality of corporatization in music is just going to take over. And it's kind of just something we've accepted. I think it's part of the reason why like we're rightly critical of the Ticketmaster issues with the current Bruce tour, but also I think all three of us kind of just like shrug our shoulders and are like, this is the way that you kind of have to see a classic rock artist. And that's how you have to see a lot of arena artists in 2022. So there's like this sense of protest that kind of goes hand in hand with like your criticism, RJ, of the lyrics to Youngstown, of like, what are we really saying here? Like, you're playing this arena. You're the person drawing people in. Like, you are an artist on the level that could do what Pearl Jam tried to do 3 years prior, where you're like, we're not going this route and playing these arenas. It's going to make things really hard on you. But I think Bruce kind of realizes it in the middle of it, because he just kind of winds it down and is like, this isn't really funny. Let's just play another song. So there's like the grandstanding, but then there's also the sense of like, all right, let's just get back to the show.
It's a little cringeworthy, I think, that whole segment. I mean, it's like the first thing was funny, and then after that, I'm like, all right, are we really like still doing this?
Yeah.
Matt, what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, the other thing is like you're making fun of the new building that all of these people are coming to see for the first time
Right.
potentially and love and stuff like that. And like if you went to a new venue and the artist got up and was like, "Man, what the fuck's up with this place?" You'd probably be like, "Oh, dude, like this is our new spot."
Yeah.
I think that a comment like that would be funnier like later on after you've established yourself there and can kind of dig into like what about the good old days at the LA Sports Arena or whatever. But I'm in agreement with them. I mean, I do. That's one of my biggest pet peeves. The new arenas that they build that are more focused on comfort than the actual experience, and also the corporate naming thing. Like, I think the coolest thing that a corporation could do would be to buy the naming rights to like a fancy new venue, but be like, we're gonna put our logo everywhere. We're gonna have it all over the scoreboards and stuff like that. But we're gonna name the actual place after like, one of the greatest athletes from the city or something like that.
Well, and that's a really good point. He does talk about that like these are this is this continuing trend of the corporate naming of public space, and he really like it's the one moment that I really identify with in the monologue is like he still believes in this idea that like the public space to see the arts is something that should still be honored, even if it's totally out of his control, totally out of rock music's control. It's this I don't know. It's both like a boomerism, like back in the good old days type of sentiment that you can rightly criticize now because like artists like Bruce Springsteen helped to generate this, the expansion of this, where our corporate companies came in and were like, "There's a lot of money to be made here. We're going to buy this and we're going to put our name all over it." But it also is this sense of like we have lost something. Where if you can't have a public space where someone who did public good gets recognized for this, rather than a corporation, we're moving in the wrong direction. But that's a whole different conversation.
Well, I just want to say we had just to kind of like actually bridge this with a conversation we had last week. We're going to wrap it up in a second, but one of our listeners who's been checking out this series sent us an article from New Jersey Arts Daily, and the part of it was just talking about the ticketing thing and where things are with Bruce right now. And one of the quotes in there is that whether his fans realize it or not, Bruce Springsteen has had an ongoing discussion with them about money throughout his career until now, which is just sort of like an interesting take. Because all that, like the conversation, it's kind of ironic, like the conversation that he's having about the Staples Center now, like the ticketing situation and where like people are in an uproar about the price of tickets. And he was sort of like, I guess in 99, like, this kind of sucks. But now he's sort of, I mean, whatever. It's a complicated discussion, but interesting timing given that like now he's kind of on the opposite side of that in terms of the public conversation.
I mean,
You got to imagine he will address this in a monologue though during the shows.
Yeah. Oh, those $5,000 seats. No, I mean, it's a good point, and I think this is why people come back to it. Not to linger on the ticketing thing, but like, if I recall correctly, tickets for this tour were like $39, something like that. And this is the point at which the Eagles were making headlines for breaking the $100 barrier on concert tickets at the same exact time. So, which he could have easily done, and he chose not to, and whatnot. But yeah, it is what it is, I suppose.
Matt, what's your most boss moment?
10th Avenue's Freeze Out. Like we said, had to experience it live. Tons of energy, amazing connection with the band. But other than that, if you weren't there, you might not get it. And it's just Bruce in all of his Bruceness.
That's a good point. You got to be there.
Yeah.
Speaking of having to be there, you guys like that? I want to say once again, congrats to the 4 winners of our AC ticket giveaway: Tim, Avi, Ian, Shane. Hope to see you all there. We are going to be back though. We're going to bring you more Bruce tomorrow. Brian, do you want to say anything about the show we're going to be talking about tomorrow, or anything else?
Yeah, I'll preview it really quickly. We're going to be jumping ahead 8.5 years to March 20th, 2008. This is a show from the Conseco Fieldhouse in Indianapolis, Indiana. I don't think there's any comments at this point in time about the naming rights for the arena. Which I will just say, if there is an arena to see an artist in America, it is actually this arena. It's the only arena in the NBA that was built solely for basketball. So it's smaller. Seats are kind of on top of the court in a really cool way. I think it'd be a great place to see a rock show at. But this is really emotional and heavy volume. This is the last volume, the last Bruce show to include Danny Federici, who would pass away less than a month later. It's a fascinating concert when you take into consideration a lot of what we've talked about here, which is what does Bruce do next? Because almost a decade later, he's released 4 records, 2 of which with the E Street Band, 2 of which solo independently on his own. One of those with the Seeger Sessions. He's played a number of unique concerts, and here he's touring behind the 2007 record Magic. And so we're hearing a lot of new Bruce, as well as like those segments of the shows that look back, as well as kind of this real emotional weight as we're starting to move into the era. We talked here in this episode about the sense of him being sorry, him thanking his bandmates, and figuring out like, how did I leave this behind for a decade and what do I do next? You're suddenly hearing a decade later, like some of these guys, and we're going to see it 3 years following this. Some of these guys are going to pass away and you're not going to be able to play with them ever again. The time is very, very valuable to play with this band. So I won't say anything more. It's a very, very emotional volume that I would encourage people to check out on Nugs, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Matt and Brian and everybody who is tuning in and helping us get the word out about the live show. We're having fun, and we're going to be back tomorrow. There's going to be a Radio Nowhere sighting. I'll just tell you that. I saw it. I heard it. It's all happening. So until tomorrow, thank you guys. We'll see you then.